2. Some rejections don't come in words. They come in the quiet between two heartbeats. I moved to the coast to write, or at least that's what I told myself. Truth was, I just needed quiet. The city had started to sound like a place full of echoes, voices that never really said anything. Here, the only sound that followed me was the tide. The cottage I rented sat on a narrow dirt road that ended at the sea. Across that road, behind a low white fence draped in vines, was her house. Old but beautiful, with pale blue shutters that seemed to fade into the sky. The first time I saw her, she was in the garden. The evening light made everything look softer. Her linen shirt, the silver in her hair, the lavender trembling in the wind. She wasn't trying to be seen. She just was like the ocean or the sky, existing quietly without effort. I stood there longer than I should have, pretending to check my phone. She must have sensed it because she looked up. Our eyes met for less than a second, and she gave a polite nod. Not distant, not warm, just measured. The kind of greeting that says, "I see you, but let's keep this peaceful." There was something in that look that unsettled me. Not attraction, not yet. Just curiosity. The kind that comes when you sense someone carries stories but doesn't invite you to read them. Over the next few days, I noticed her rhythm. Early mornings with a mug of tea on her porch. Afternoons spent pruning the same plants she'd already tended the day before. Evenings walking her dog along the cliffs, where the sunset turned the water gold. Everything about her life seemed deliberate, not lonely, but contained. I didn't even know her name yet, but she had already become part of my routine. I'd find myself waiting for that moment, when she'd step outside, hair loosely tied, sleeves rolled up, the kind of small sight that suddenly feels like meaning. One afternoon, as I carried groceries past her fence, a gust of wind sent her garden notes scattering across the path. Without thinking, I caught a few and handed them back. "You keep track of everything that blooms?" I asked. She smiled faintly, not quite meeting my eyes. "It helps me remember what survives." Her voice was calm, low, the kind that makes you want to ask questions you have no right to ask. That was the first time I heard her speak, and somehow it was enough to keep me thinking about her for the rest of the night. I didn't know it yet, but her silence, the way she spoke less than she needed to, would become the thing that drew me in the most. There was gravity in her quiet, the kind that doesn't pull suddenly, but slowly, until one day you realize you've already been caught. For days after that small exchange by her garden, I found myself replaying her words. "It helps me remember what survives." They lingered like a melody I couldn't name. Her name, I eventually learned, was Clara. The postman said it casually one morning, as if naming her would make her any less of a mystery. Didn't. If anything, it made her presence feel more real, and more impossible to ignore. Our conversations began the way most harmless things do, short, safe, almost forgettable. "Morning," she'd say, watering the lavender. "Morning," I'd reply, pretending to check the mail I didn't have. Then one morning, she asked about my writing. I told her I was working on a novel, though working was generous. I'd been staring at blank pages for weeks. "What's it about?" she asked. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. She smiled. A small, knowing smile that softened her whole face. "Maybe it's not supposed to be about something. Maybe it's supposed to become something." That was Clara. Simple words said like truth. We started having coffee together on our porches, hers shaded by ivy, mine catching the morning sun. She'd bring a second mug without asking if I wanted it. I learned she preferred her coffee black, strong enough to wake the heart before the mind. We talked about music, poetry, the quiet ache of living alone. She loved Neruda and the sound of rain against glass. I told her I loved silence, and she smiled as if to say, "Then you must love me already." Sometimes, she'd pause mid-sentence, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, as though she was listening to something only she could hear. Those moments taught me more about her than her words ever could. There was a history behind her calm. Not sadness exactly, but something close to it. The more time I spent with her, the more I noticed the small things. How she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was uncertain. How her fingers lingered on the rim of her cup, tracing circles absent-mindedly. How her laughter, quiet and brief, always ended with a sigh, like she was pulling herself back from a place she didn't allow herself to stay. One afternoon, as she handed me a book of poetry, our fingers brushed. It was nothing, a second, a spark. But the warmth of that moment stayed long after she'd gone inside. That night I wrote again, not about her exactly, but about stillness. About the way some people speak through the spaces between their words. And as I looked out at the dim glow of her window, I realized something simple and terrifying. I was beginning to wait for her. Not out of loneliness, but because every quiet moment with her made the world feel more alive. Clara didn't fill the silence. She made it beautiful. The rain started just after sunset, a slow drizzle that blurred the sky into silver. I'd been writing, or pretending to, when I saw her outside, gathering the last of her laundry from the line. Her white shirt clung to her arms, and droplets traced the edges of her hair. I grabbed an umbrella and walked over before I could talk myself out of it. "You'll catch a cold," I said, raising the umbrella above her. She smiled faintly. "You sound like my husband used to." Then, realizing what she'd said, she looked away. Old habits, I guess. We stood there in the rain's rhythm, the umbrella barely covering both of us. I could smell the lavender from her garden, the warmth of her skin mixed with the damp air. She didn't step closer, but she didn't move away either. When the thunder rolled, she nodded toward her porch. "Come in for a while. No sense standing here pretending we're not both getting soaked." Inside, everything smelled like chamomile and wood polish. There were books stacked neatly on the table, and an old record player that looked as if it had lived 100 quiet evenings. She handed me a towel and poured tea into 2 mismatched cups. The sound of rain filled the silence between us. She sat by the window, eyes on the storm. "You miss him?" I asked carefully. Her eyes softened. "Every day," she said. "But missing someone doesn't mean you stop living. It just means you learn how to keep them in the quiet parts of you." She turned to me then, her gaze steady. "And you? Who are you missing?" I laughed under my breath. "Someone I never had." That made her smile. A sad, understanding smile that felt like it belonged only to us. There was a moment, maybe only a heartbeat, when our eyes met and didn't look away. Something unspoken passed between us. Recognition, longing, and the sudden awareness that whatever this was, it was already too much. She broke the gaze first, looking down at her tea. "You should be careful," she murmured. "People will talk." "About what?" "About things that shouldn't matter but always do." I didn't have an answer. The rain outside softened to a whisper. The silence stretched until it was almost unbearable. When I finally stood to leave, she didn't stop me. But as I reached the door, I heard her say, barely above a whisper, "Thank you for the umbrella." It wasn't about the umbrella, we both knew that. It was her way of saying this was too close, and thank you for understanding. That night, lying awake to the sound of the storm, I realized I had crossed a line I couldn't see. One drawn not in words, but in silence. And yet, somehow, her silence felt like the kindest thing she could have given me. The storm had passed, but something between us hadn't settled. For days after that night, Clara kept her distance. Our usual porch coffees stopped. Her gate stayed closed. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, that we were just neighbors, but every time I saw her garden without her in it, the silence felt heavier. Then one afternoon, I heard a sharp crack outside, with splintering, followed by her quiet curse. Her fence had collapsed under the weight of the rain. Without thinking, I went over. "Looks like it gave up," I said, trying to sound light. She sighed, brushing her hair from her face. "It's been threatening to for weeks. Guess it finally decided to quit pretending." We worked side by side in silence, mending the fence under a weak sun. Her hands were steady but pale, and I noticed the thin scar along her wrist, the kind that told a story she'd never say aloud. When I asked about it, she simply said, "Gardening accident," and changed the subject. Once we finished, she wiped her palms on her jeans and glanced at me. "You should come in. I owe you tea at least." Inside, her home felt different this time, not mysterious but human. Lived in. A half-finished painting leaned against the wall, and the faint scent of rain still hung in the air. I noticed the framed photographs on a low shelf. Her and a man with kind eyes, arms around each other in front of the same house. She caught me looking. For a moment, her breath hitched. Then she spoke softly, almost to herself. He was a good man, the kind who always tried to understand me, even when I couldn't understand myself. Her voice trembled, just a little. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The silence that followed said everything. The love that lasted, the loss that never really left. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. She shook her head. "Don't be. Missing him isn't sadness anymore. It's just proof that he mattered." For a long while, neither of us spoke. The sound of the kettle filled the space between us. Gentle, rhythmic, grounding. When she handed me the teacup, our fingers brushed again. This time, she didn't pull away. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for a heartbeat, everything slowed. The ticking clock, the rain-soft air, the pulse in my throat. I could feel the warmth of her hand, the faint tremor that betrayed everything her words refused to. Then she drew a breath and smiled. That quiet, careful smile that always felt like both invitation and warning. "Thank you," she said, "for helping." She meant the fence. But I think in some small way she meant more. When I left, I glanced back through her window. She was standing where I'd left her, motionless, looking at the repaired fence. I realized then that sometimes you don't have to fix something to be let in. You just have to show you're willing to try. Autumn had begun to change the air, softer light, slower days, a chill that lingered in the evenings. Clara's garden had begun to fade, yet she still walked through it every morning as if refusing to let it go. I watched her sometimes from my porch, notebook open but unwritten. She had become the pause between my thoughts, the stillness I both needed and feared. One evening, I brought over a stack of pages, something I hadn't shown anyone. "I finished a draft," I told her. "I wanted your opinion." She raised an eyebrow. "You trust me with that?" "I trust you with more than that." Her smile faltered, a brief, almost invisible shift. She motioned for me to sit. The lamp cast a golden light across her living room, making every shadow seem deliberate. I began to read aloud. The story wasn't really about her, but it was, in all the ways that mattered, about a woman who held too much silence inside her, and a man who didn't know how to leave it untouched. My voice shook toward the end. When I looked up, Clara's eyes were glistening, not with tears exactly, but with something softer. Understanding, maybe, or fear. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "But you shouldn't give away that kind of honesty so easily." "I didn't," I said quietly. "You pulled it out of me." For a long moment, she said nothing. The clock ticked. The wind pressed against the window. She stood, walked toward the shelves, then stopped halfway, caught between leaving and staying. When she turned back, her expression was unreadable. "You're young," she said softly. "You think every connection has to mean something, doesn't it?" She exhaled, the kind of sigh that sounds like surrender. "Some things only mean what we don't let them become." Then she took a step closer, close enough that I could see the faint freckles near her collarbone, the way her breath trembled before each word. "You shouldn't look at me like that," she murmured. "Like what?" "Like I'm someone you're allowed to love." Her words should have stopped me. Instead, they anchored me in place. The silence stretched, long, fragile, electric. For a heartbeat, I thought she might close the distance. Her hand hovered near mine, close enough that I could feel her warmth. But she didn't touch me. She only whispered, "Please don't make me forget the line." Then she stepped back, the space between us suddenly enormous. Outside, the first rain of autumn began to fall, slow, hesitant drops against the glass. I stood there, not knowing what to say, watching her gather herself back into the calm I had almost undone. When I finally left, her voice followed me to the door. "Some words are beautiful only because they're never said." And in that moment I understood. Our silence had become its own language, and every word after it would have been too loud. After that night, Clara disappeared into her silence. The next morning, her porch was empty. No coffee cups, no open book on the railing, no soft hum of her favorite records drifting through the window. The lavender had begun to brown at the edges, and for the first time since I'd moved there, her house looked still. Days turned into a week, and though I told myself I wouldn't, I waited. For her shadow through the curtain, for the sound of her footsteps across the gravel, for the small wave she used to give without looking up. None came. I tried to write again, but every sentence sounded like her voice. Calm, measured, unfinished. I wrote letters instead, never meant to be sent. In them, I confessed everything I didn't say that night, that her silence didn't scare me, that it made me feel seen, that maybe love didn't have to look the same for both of us. I folded each page and tucked it into a drawer. Maybe one day, when I was braver, I'd give them to her. One morning, I saw her walking by the shoreline. The sea was rough that day, restless and gray. I almost called out her name, but something in her posture stopped me. The way her shoulders were drawn in, the way her gaze was fixed on the horizon like she was afraid to look back. I walked beside her anyway, a few steps behind, not saying a word. The waves crashed, and the wind pulled strands of her hair across her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was nearly lost in the surf. "Sometimes silence is mercy," she said. I didn't ask what she meant. I just stood there, feeling the weight of it settle between us. When she turned to face me, her eyes weren't cold. They were kind. "You don't need my words to understand me," she said softly. "You already do." And then she smiled, small, fleeting, final, and walked away. I watched her figure blur into the mist, her footsteps fading into the sound of the sea. That night, the house felt heavier than usual. I brewed tea just to hold something warm. Outside, the tide crept closer to the cliffs, and I realized she was right. Her silence wasn't rejection. It was protection. A way of saying, I care for you too much to let you lose yourself in me. I began to write again, not about love as something to chase, but as something that teaches. Something that doesn't always end in togetherness, but in understanding. Every word I wrote carried a trace of her. The calm, the restraint, the quiet strength of someone who knew that love doesn't always need to be spoken to be felt. And in that realization, I found peace. Not the kind that forgets, but the kind that remembers gently. It was almost winter when I found the letter. It had been weeks since I'd last seen Clara. Her cottage remained quiet, curtains drawn, garden untended, the porch chair empty. The lavender had wilted completely, brittle and pale, but still carried a faint scent when the wind brushed through it. That morning, as I stepped outside to check the mail I never expected, I saw a small envelope resting against my door. No name, no address, just the faint impression of her handwriting, delicate and deliberate. Inside, there was no letter in the usual sense, no explanations, no long confessions. Just a pressed sprig of lavender, its scent still alive, and one line written in her graceful script. I never said no to you. I only didn't know how to say yes. I stood there for a long time, reading the sentence over and over, as if the meaning might change. Didn't. It was her. Quiet, honest, and impossibly kind even in farewell. Later that day, I walked to the cliffs where we used to stand. The sea was calm, the same soft gray she loved, the same wind that once carried her laughter. I held the lavender in my palm and closed my eyes. For the first time, the silence didn't ache. Felt like an answer. Clara's absence became something sacred, something I carried not in loss but in memory. She hadn't left to forget me. She'd left to protect the kind of peace she'd finally found. And in her own quiet way, she'd given me mine too. I went back to writing. The story I'd been struggling to finish found its ending. Not in grand gestures, but in restraint. A love that existed not through possession, but through presence. Not through words, but through understanding. When I read the final lines aloud, I realized they weren't just about her. They were from her. Every silence she'd ever given me had been her way of speaking without saying a word. Months later, The new tenants moved into her cottage. A young couple, always laughing, always alive. I watched them plant fresh flowers where the lavender once stood, and I smiled. The house wasn't meant to stay quiet forever. It had simply been waiting for sound again. Sometimes, in the evenings, I still walk the shoreline. The wind smells faintly of salt and something sweet, and if I close my eyes, I can almost hear her voice, soft, steady, unafraid. "Some things aren't meant to be held," she'd once said. "They're meant to stay with you quietly." She was right. Her silence had once hurt. Now it feels like a heartbeat, a reminder that love doesn't have to last to be real. I keep her lavender pressed between the pages of my notebook. Its color fading, but its scent still there, gentle, familiar, and eternal. And sometimes, when I write, I still whisper her name. Not to call her back, but to thank her for teaching me that silence can speak love just as loudly as words ever could.